Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
I walked across that stage alone. But it wasn't the diplomas in their hands my parents cared about. They were fingering appointment cards for my sister's Botox. It's strange, the things that become burned into your memory. I don't remember the face of the principal as she handed me the diploma. I don't remember what the stage smelled like, or if my shoes made that embarrassing clack on the polished wood floor. But I do remember the sound of the empty chair creaking beside me. The two chairs, actually, the ones reserved for my parents. Reserved, but untouched. They'd promised they'd be there. And at first I believed them, because that's what you do, right? Even if the past gives you every reason to doubt, you still hope. Because no one wants to imagine that they could matter so little on the biggest day of their life. My name is Caroline Perez. And last week, I graduated as the Valedictorian of Westfield High. Straight A's, National Honor Society, 3 years on debate team, 1 year as captain. I'd given up everything that normal high schoolers fill their time with. No prom, no parties, not even a boyfriend. Just so I could make my parents proud. I told myself it would be worth it when they saw me walk across that stage. When they heard my name called first. When they looked at each other and whispered, "That's our daughter." But they didn't whisper anything. They weren't there. Instead, they were at my sister Emma's facial appointment in Scottsdale. Something about her needing skin prep before her upcoming pageant, an event she's only been talking about for the last 2 months, as if the world should stop spinning until she gets crowned Junior Miss Desert Bloom, or whatever the title is this year. And look, I'm not trying to drag Emma through the mud. She's my younger sister. She's 17. She's been obsessed with her looks since she discovered lip gloss in the 5th grade. She's got followers on Instagram, sponsorships for tanning lotion, and a personality that lights up a room when she walks into it. People love her instantly, including and especially my parents. Me, I'm the quiet one, the smart one, the responsible one, which is just parent speak for the one we don't have to think about. My wins never needed balloons or Instagram posts. They just needed to happen quietly, so no one had to rearrange their spa day. The day before graduation, my mom sat across from me at the kitchen counter, cutting coupons for teeth whitening strips. She said, "You know we love you, Caroline. But Emma's appointment was booked months ago. It's her big week, too." And I just nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? Start screaming? Tell her she's picking Botox over a diploma? Instead, I swallowed the words like I always do, like they taste better with silence. The morning of graduation, I curled my hair by myself, did my makeup in the dim bathroom light, and slipped into my cap and gown without a single photo being taken. No stand by the door and smile, no hold your diploma up for grandma. They weren't coming. They didn't even pretend they might, so I walked. The school gym was packed. Families cheering, babies crying, the occasional squeak of rubber soles against the bleachers. Everyone was with someone, everyone except me. I sat between the twins who ran cross-country and the girl who got pregnant last spring, and somehow still graduated with a 3.4. They had parents waving and crying, holding bouquets. I had an extra seat where my mom should have been, and another where my dad might have sat, his camera ready and annoyingly loud. When the principal called my name, the applause was loud, but it didn't feel like it was for mine. It felt like background noise, like the soundtrack to someone else's moment. I smiled anyway, took the diploma, shook hands, posed for the school photographer, who didn't know he was taking the only picture I'd have from that day. Then it was time for my speech. As I stood and walked to the podium, every step felt like a test, not just of nerves, but of restraint. I'd memorized the speech weeks ago. It was polished, safe, the kind of speech parents would clap for politely while pretending to listen. But now, standing in front of a gym full of faces, I couldn't feel those words anymore. I couldn't feel anything except the emptiness in my chest, where their voices should have been. I cleared my throat. The gym quieted. Hundreds of eyes were on me, but the 2 pairs that mattered most were still at a spa 30 minutes away, probably discussing eyebrow shape while their daughter stood alone with a microphone in her hand. I looked out at the sea of faces, and for a second, I wanted to cry. But instead, I smiled. Because I realized something. They'd given me the perfect ending. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, just as the first words escaped my lips, I saw the double doors at the back of the gym swing open. My parents walked in, late. Lisa and Robert Perez, dressed like they came straight from brunch, walked in slow, like nothing was wrong. My mom still had her sunglasses on. My dad was fiddling with the keys in his pocket. And my sister, of course, trailed behind them, scrolling on her phone. They made it just in time, for the speech. And they had no idea what was coming. The silence that settled across the gymnasium the moment I stepped up to the microphone wasn't the kind that comes from reverence or respect. It was the kind that buzzes in your ears, that presses against your chest, that makes your throat dry even though you've been rehearsing your speech for months. Alone in your room, whispering into the mirror so quietly you wouldn't wake the house. My fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the paper, not because I needed the words. They were already tattooed behind my eyes, but because holding something kept me grounded in that moment. Like I was clinging to the last safe thing I had before I jumped off the edge I knew I wasn't supposed to go near. My parents stood at the back of the gym, probably thinking their late entrance would go unnoticed, probably believing their presence alone would redeem their absence from the morning, probably assuming I would flash them a grateful smile from the stage, and all would be forgiven in that instant. But what they didn't understand, what they never seemed to understand, was that it wasn't about their physical presence, it was about the years of absence that led to this moment. The 1,000 tiny dismissals, the birthday parties missed for more important plans, the science fairs where Emma's ballet recital took priority, the college acceptance letters met with nods instead of celebrations. Their late arrival was just the final punctuation on a story I'd been trying not to tell. I started slow, my voice clear but controlled, the kind of tone that could have easily belonged to someone about to deliver a perfectly pleasant address about gratitude and perseverance and school spirit. I thanked the faculty, the administration, and the janitors who kept the hallways smelling less like feet than one would expect from a building full of teenagers. I made a few jokes, safe ones, the kind that got polite laughter but didn't ruffle feathers. And then gradually, as if I were shifting gears in a car I'd learned to drive by sheer necessity, I veered into the territory I hadn't written down but had been drafting in my head for years. I think, I said, and I remember every breath of that moment, what drives us isn't always the cheerleaders or the trophies or the people who show up with flowers and loud clapping. Sometimes it's the silence that drives us. Sometimes it's the empty seats we can't stop looking at, even when we tell ourselves we don't care anymore. I paused there, not for effect, but because I had to. Because I could feel my heart thudding in my throat, and if I didn't breathe, I wasn't sure I could keep speaking. The room had shifted. You could sense it. There was a stillness that wasn't just politeness. It was tension, confusion, maybe even curiosity. I think a few people turned to look toward the back, and I wonder now if, in that moment, my parents felt the weight of what was coming. I want to thank my classmates, I continued, more firmly now, like each word gave me new footing. The ones who laughed at my jokes when no one else got them. The ones who handed me tissues during finals week and shared their Spotify playlists when I was one caffeine crash away from a breakdown. You know who you are. I glanced toward the front rows. My teachers, Mr. Vogel, who once told me I had the sharpest mind he'd ever seen in 20 years of teaching. Mrs. Myers, who stayed late to help me prep for state debate. Coach Dunn, who taught me how to channel rage into strategy instead of sarcasm. Their faces were open, some smiling, some clearly sensing that something else was coming. And I want to thank my family, I said, my voice lowering slightly, the way it does when you don't want to sound bitter, but you don't know how to avoid it. Because, believe it or not, they gave me something even more valuable than support. They gave me a reason to push harder, a reason to stay up late and chase the top spot, a reason to keep going when it felt like no one was watching. My gaze shifted to the back, just briefly, just enough to let them know I didn't need to name names. To those who didn't come today, thank you, I said. And I swear I could hear someone drop a water bottle on the bleachers behind me. You gave me something to prove. I didn't stop for applause. I didn't wait for recognition or redemption. I stepped down from the podium and walked back to my seat, eyes forward, chin up, heart thundering like it might tear through my ribs. The clapping started a beat too late, like everyone in the gym needed an extra second to process whether I'd actually said what they thought I said. And once it started, it wasn't the explosive kind. It was careful, hesitant, like people weren't sure if they were supposed to clap or hold their breath. I sat back down and stared ahead, not at the crowd, not at the teachers, but at the space where my parents should have been hours earlier, when I was pinning my cap into place and pacing the bathroom floor and wondering whether it would matter to anyone if I tripped walking across the stage. And then I heard it, heels on hardwood, the slow, awkward shuffle of people trying to exit quietly but failing. My parents were leaving, not walking up to hug me, not trying to speak to me, just leaving. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mrs. Myers frown slightly, leaning toward the aisle, watching them go. Emma was still scrolling on her phone. I focused on my hands instead, folded neatly in my lap. Calm on the outside, while inside, I felt like a dam had cracked somewhere deep in my chest, and the water wasn't stopping. The ceremony wrapped up quickly after that. Diplomas handed out, names called, caps tossed. People crying and hugging and taking 1,000 pictures to capture the moment. I took none. I walked out the same way I walked in, alone. But this time, there was a difference. This time, every step I took felt deliberate, charged, like I was moving toward something instead of away from it. I thought the moment would end there. I thought my speech would be my one act of defiance, my last word. But as I checked my phone later that night, sitting in the dark of my bedroom with my cap still on the floor and my gown hanging limply from the closet door, I saw a message request I hadn't expected. Meet me at school. I want to help. No name, just those 8 words. And suddenly I knew the story wasn't finished. Not even close. It's one thing to speak your truth in front of an auditorium filled with people who don't really know the full picture, and it's another thing entirely to walk through the crowded hallways of your small hometown high school. The day after that truth echoes off the gymnasium walls and lands like a grenade in the middle of your life. With the dust still settling and the damage still being assessed by anyone who caught the explosion or heard about it secondhand, from their cousin's best friend who swears they saw a teacher wipe away a tear after your last line. The thing no one tells you about saying the words you've swallowed your whole life is that once they're out, they keep ricocheting, not just in your head, but in the heads of everyone who heard them, and especially in the ears of the people you aim them at, whether you intended to or not. The morning after graduation, I woke up to 3 things: a pounding headache I didn't drink enough water to explain, a voicemail from my aunt saying she heard what happened, and a front-page post on the local community Facebook group that read, "Valedictorian speech, powerful or petty?" with a blurry photo of me mid-sentence, looking way more composed than I felt in that moment. The comments naturally were a mess. A perfect balance of older women calling me brave and poised, and a handful of bored dads writing things like, "typical ungrateful Gen Z behavior." I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't need to. The story had already taken on a life of its own, and in a town like ours, where nothing more exciting than a football championship ever happens, the fallout was inevitable. My phone buzzed nonstop for the first few hours, and every message seemed to come from a different emotional corner. There were friends from school I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly telling me how proud they were of me for standing up for myself. Some even apologizing for not realizing how I felt all these years, as if I'd been screaming my pain behind soundproof glass. Then there were teachers emailing me, some subtle, some bold, saying they'd shown my speech to their younger students as an example of owning your voice. And then, of course, came the other kind of attention, the not-so-friendly texts, the ones that accused me of ruining my parents' reputation, of being dramatic, selfish, or worse, performative, as if I'd written that speech for clout and not out of years of quiet ache. I didn't hear from my parents at all. Not a text, not a call, not even a passive-aggressive note slid under my door, like when I used to slam it too loud as a teenager. And that silence, that more than anything confirmed everything I had said. Emma, on the other hand, made sure her opinion was loud and crystal clear. She stormed into my room sometime around noon, phone in hand, mascara perfectly smudged from what I assume were tears, or at least an attempt to make it look like she'd cried. And she launched into a speech that made mine seem tame by comparison. "You embarrassed us," she said, her voice high and breathless, like she'd just run through a monologue in her head 20 times before coming in. "You humiliated Mom and Dad in front of the entire town. Do you even understand what you did?" I sat on the edge of my bed, arms folded, watching her pace in my doorway, like she owned the floor. "Did you watch it?" I asked calmly, not because I didn't care, but because I'd already spent too much energy caring for people who couldn't bother to show up. She scoffed. "Of course I did. Everyone's watched it. You're basically viral now." "Then you know I didn't name anyone. I didn't lie. I didn't even yell." She paused for half a second, maybe realizing that was true, then shook her head again. "But you knew what you were doing. You made them look like monsters." "They did that part themselves," I said, and I meant it. Not with venom, but with the kind of tired truth you can't really argue against. Emma didn't respond to that. She just stood there for a beat, looked at me like she didn't recognize who I was anymore, then turned on her heel and left without slamming the door. A small miracle, given our shared family DNA. The day dragged after that. I ignored the buzz of my phone, the ringing of the house line, even the neighbor who stopped by with a basket of congratulations muffins, and an awkward question about whether my parents were okay. I didn't know how to answer that. I didn't even know if they were home. And then, sometime around 9 that night, when the sky outside had finally turned black and the house had grown quiet in that unsettling way that made you question if it had ever been loud to begin with, I walked into the kitchen and did something I hadn't planned, hadn't even thought about until I found myself doing it. I printed out the speech, not the clean version, not the one with the jokes and the safe platitudes. The version I actually gave, every raw word. I taped it to the fridge, dead center, and at the bottom, in thick red Sharpie, I wrote, "Read this." And then I went back to my room. I didn't hear footsteps down the hallway. I didn't hear whispered arguments or quiet sobs, or even the crinkle of the page being pulled down. Maybe they ignored it. Maybe they read it in the middle of the night when they thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe they stood in front of it for a full 10 minutes and said nothing at all. I still don't know. What I do know is that the next morning, when I came downstairs, the speech was gone. No one said a word, but something in the air had shifted. And just when I thought the storm had peaked, I remembered the message waiting on my phone, the anonymous invitation I hadn't replied to, hadn't even processed until the adrenaline of the past 24 hours had started to fade. "Meet me at school. I want to help." Something told me it wasn't just another student. And as I stood at the threshold of what felt like the next part of a story I didn't even realize I was writing, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. When I stepped into the school building that night, long after the janitors had clocked out and the last echoes of graduation had faded from the locker-lined hallways, the place felt eerie, like it was holding its breath, not in fear, but in anticipation, as though even the walls knew something was about to happen that didn't belong in the tidy categories of student drama or teen rebellion, something quiet and sharp and calculated, something I hadn't planned on, but suddenly felt like I'd been waiting for my whole life. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and leftover cafeteria detergent, and the glow from the emergency lights along the baseboards cast just enough of a dull gleam across the corridor to remind me how many nights I'd walked these halls alone. Long after debate practice had ended, long after Emma had been picked up from cheer or pageant or eyebrow threading, whatever the day's priority had been, while I stayed behind, unnoticed, working on the things I thought might one day earn me a moment like graduation, A moment that had already come and gone without the people who were supposed to care the most. I didn't know what to expect when I got the message. I didn't even know who I thought it might be, though I'd ruled out the obvious contenders. No teacher would reach out that cryptically, and no friend would be vague when they could just FaceTime. But something about the way it was written, simple, confident, direct, felt intentional, so I went. I found Marcus sitting in the auditorium, legs draped over the seat in front of him, hoodie pulled up even though it was June and sticky outside, with his phone glowing in his lap and a stack of old theater programs scattered beside him like he'd been digging through the past for inspiration. He didn't look surprised to see me, just nodded once, like we'd already agreed this meeting would happen, like I was late to a plan he'd been organizing quietly in the shadows. "I saw your speech," he said, without standing up or gesturing for me to sit. But I did anyway, a few seats down, because something about the way he said it made me feel like sitting was the only correct response. It was brutal but honest. I wasn't in the mood for compliments disguised as critiques, but there was no smugness in his tone, no condescension, just interest, curiosity, like he wasn't shocked by what I'd done but intrigued by what I'd do next. "I didn't plan to say it," I replied, my voice lower than I intended, the kind of voice you use when the walls feel like they might have ears. "It just happened." "That's how the best stuff happens," he said, finally turning toward me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "But now you've got a choice. You can let it fizzle, or you can make it count." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Marcus grinned then, not in a mocking way, but with the kind of grin that made you realize he'd been waiting for you to catch up to something he'd already seen. "You started something, Caroline. People are paying attention. They're questioning things. That kind of momentum doesn't last long in a place like this, unless you give them something to remember." And that was how the idea began. Not as a plotted act of revenge, not as a vendetta, but as a kind of performance. A message wrapped in creativity, something louder than a speech, but quieter than a scandal. Marcus, whose reputation up until this point had been mostly tied to his borderline inappropriate film projects for senior media class, suggested a flash mob poetry performance, not the dancing kind, but the spoken word kind. Dozens of us scattered through the school cafeteria during the last official day, standing one by one to recite stanzas about expectations and pressure and invisibility, and the absurdity of being told to dream big while being treated like we're in the way. We spent the next 48 hours pulling it together, recruiting students who'd once been silenced in class discussions, students who never got picked for lead roles or varsity teams or scholarships because they didn't smile the right way, or wear the right brand of shoes, or have parents who donated enough to the PTA fundraisers. We met at odd hours, in basements, over coffee, in quiet corners of the local library. We wrote and rewrote lines, read them aloud, scrapped them, built them again, until the words hummed with truth. When the moment came, it was almost too perfect. The bell had just rung for fourth period, the cafeteria was loud with end-of-year chaos, and someone turned off the speaker music just as the first student stood on their chair and began to speak. "I was told I was too loud," she said, voice clear, echoing off the walls. Then another voice from across the room. "I was told I was too quiet." Then another. "I was told my name was too hard to pronounce, so I stopped correcting people." One by one, more voices joined, including mine. "I was told to aim for Harvard," I said, standing near the lunch line, but not to be disappointed when we couldn't afford the visit. The room fell silent, phones were raised, eyes were wide. By the end, when we all stood, when we all finished our last lines together, "We are here. We are loud. We are not what you made us pretend to be." The silence was so complete it felt sacred, and then someone clapped. Then another, then the entire room erupted, not in laughter or mockery, but in the kind of applause that isn't just about liking what you heard, but about recognizing yourself in it. The video hit social media within hours. Local news picked it up. Someone's older brother who went to NYU tagged a media outlet. Suddenly, I wasn't just the girl who gave the awkward speech at graduation. I was the voice of a movement, or at least the face of a moment. And just like that, the narrative started to shift. But not everyone was cheering. My parents, predictably, were not thrilled. I came home that evening to a living room full of tension, with my father sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch and my mother pacing in slow, rehearsed circles, like she was waiting for a cue that never came. They didn't yell, they didn't accuse, they just asked, in tight voices, why I couldn't have kept things private, why I had to drag family business into the spotlight. I told them it wasn't about dragging anything. It was about finally having a voice in a household where being quiet was the only way to survive. They didn't respond. Emma didn't say anything either, but she didn't look away. And that was new. I went to bed that night thinking maybe I'd said everything I needed to say, but then I remembered the commencement ceremony had been recorded. The official version edited and prepped for local broadcast. The one parents always ordered to remember the day their child walked the stage. And I had one more thing left to do. There's a particular weight that settles in your chest when you realize the story you've spent your entire adolescence trying to write into something triumphant has become less about victory and more about visibility, a kind of raw, uneven exposure that leaves you wondering whether all the pieces of yourself you've laid bare for the world to examine will ever truly be understood the way you intended, or if they'll just be remembered as moments of rebellion, as scenes in someone else's cautionary tale. In the days following the flash mob performance, I found myself in that uneasy space between vindication and vulnerability, where people praised my courage from a distance, reposted my lines like scripture, and treated me like a symbol for something larger than my own pain. But symbols are static, and I was still moving, still unsure, still picking apart the ruins of a family I hadn't meant to destroy, but hadn't known how to save either. The video of the cafeteria performance had spread further than I anticipated, faster than I could track. Some people praised it as an act of creative protest. Others criticized it as a public tantrum disguised as poetry, but most of them didn't know me, didn't know the years of quiet, the thousands of hours spent trying not to resent the people I loved for loving someone else more loudly, more visibly, more comfortably. My parents hadn't spoken to me since the night I confronted them in the living room, and the silence now felt different. Not the cold dismissal I was used to, but something more uncertain, almost fragile, like they didn't know how to respond to a version of me they hadn't prepared for. And still, the final act lingered in my mind, that last unsettled piece of the story. I wasn't sure I should touch, but couldn't ignore either. The commencement ceremony, recorded, packaged, distributed by the district for those who couldn't attend. It was a sanitized version of what happened, with the camera cutting away from my parents' late entrance, muting the whispers during my speech, polishing the whole thing until it felt like a highlight reel instead of a reckoning. It felt dishonest, incomplete, but also it felt like an opportunity. So I did something that, in hindsight, could be considered either brilliant or reckless, depending on who you ask. I called in a favor. Mr. Vogel, my AP Lit teacher, had always been one of the few adults who seemed to actually see me. Not just my grades or my punctuality or my quiet competence, but the girl behind all of it. The one who scribbled thoughts in the margins of her essays that didn't belong to any rubric. I told him what I wanted to do, and to his credit, he didn't blink. He just asked if I was sure. I wasn't. I told him I was anyway. The night of the planned viewing, I invited my family into the living room, not as an act of reconciliation, but as a sort of neutral territory, a place where we could all watch the truth unfold without yelling, without accusations, without interruptions. I invited a few classmates too, the ones who had stood beside me in the cafeteria, not because I wanted an audience, but because I needed witnesses, people who knew the full version of me, not just the version that fit inside the roles assigned by family, by school, by the expectations we all wear like ill-fitting uniforms. My dad sat stiffly in his recliner, arms crossed in that familiar posture of controlled irritation, while my mother perched on the edge of the couch like she might bolt at any moment if the air got too uncomfortable. Emma was there too, scrolling through her phone with an expression that said she was above all of this, but hadn't dared to not show up. When the video began, it looked just like they expected, polished, professional, forgettable. But 15 minutes in, the screen glitched, and the real footage took over. Not the district's version, but the raw recording I'd gotten from Marcus, the one that showed everything. They watched themselves walk in late. They watched me pause, my jaw tighten, my voice drop as I delivered the speech they didn't know I had the guts to give. And then came the final part. The flash mob edited in, the poetry overlay, the crescendo of voices rising from the cafeteria, set against a soft instrumental score Marcus had added in post-production. It was beautiful. It was angry. It was mine. When the screen went black, no one said anything, not right away. The silence stretched out long and thin, and I let it because I wanted them to feel the weight of it. Not as punishment, but as truth. Finally, I turned to them, not accusingly, not dramatically, but with a quiet question that had been sitting in my chest for longer than I could remember. "What part of me," I asked, "made you think I didn't matter?" My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. My father blinked, as if surprised by the question, though I couldn't tell if it was the content or the fact that I had dared to ask it out loud. Emma looked away. No one answered. No apology, no denial, just a shared discomfort, a ripple of realization, maybe even shame, but not the kind that fixes anything, the kind that lingers. I stood not to storm off, not to make a point, but because I was finished. I walked upstairs and left them there with the silence, the black screen, and the echoes of a story they never bothered to listen to, until it was projected right in front of their faces. The next morning, I returned to the gymnasium, empty now, the chairs stacked, the banners removed. The stage just a stage again. I brought a single rose and placed it on the seat where my mother should have sat. I placed another on the seat that should have held my father. And then I stood there quiet, still, not waiting for them to appear, but honoring the space they had failed to fill. As I walked out, the echo of my own footsteps followed me, steady, unhurried, unafraid. I don't know if they'll ever come back and fill those seats, but I do know that I will never again shrink myself to fit into a silence they mistake for obedience. I walked alone, and now they get to decide if they'll walk back with me.